Take that ring off her hand. It belongs to a dead prince. The command thundered across the royal court, yet no one moved. Hundreds of nobles, royal guards, scholars, and council members stood frozen beneath the towering stained-glass windows of Blackwood Castle, their eyes fixed on the young Omega healer standing alone at the center of the great hall. Emily Harper barely seemed to notice the whispers spreading through the chamber like wildfire. Her breathing remained steady as she stared at the ancient silver signet ring resting securely around her finger. She had never seen it before that morning. She had never tried to claim it. Yet no matter how hard the royal jewelers pulled, twisted, or examined it, the ring refused to leave her hand. At the far end of the hall, Alpha King William Blackwood slowly rose from his throne despite the worried protests of his advisors. His silver hair reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through the cathedral windows, and his tired blue eyes never left the ring. Around him, members of the royal council exchanged frightened glances because every person inside the kingdom recognized that symbol. It belonged to Prince Nathaniel Blackwood, the heir to the throne who had disappeared 7 years earlier without leaving behind a single trace except unanswered questions. Lord Victor Ashford, the king's most trusted advisor, stepped forward with controlled confidence, though the tension hidden beneath his calm voice was impossible to ignore. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the girl has deceived this court. That ring should have remained buried with the prince." Emily looked down at the silver crest resting against her skin. It felt strangely warm, almost alive, as though it had been waiting years to find its way back into daylight. She did not understand why everyone believed she had stolen it because only moments earlier she had been nothing more than an unknown village healer carrying a worn leather satchel filled with herbs and handwritten remedies. She had entered the royal court through the servants' gate without anyone recognizing her name. Several noble healers had laughed quietly at the sight of her simple forest green dress and weathered boots. One woman even whispered that the palace must have become desperate if it invited country healers to treat a king. Emily had ignored every insult. She came for only one reason. 3 days earlier, a royal messenger had arrived at her small woodland cottage carrying an official summons sealed with the Blackwood crest. The Alpha King had grown mysteriously weaker despite being examined by every celebrated healer across the kingdom. As the youngest healer ever invited into the royal court, Emily knew she had little chance of changing anything, but she could not refuse someone asking for help. She remembered taking one last look at her quiet cottage before leaving at sunrise, never imagining that her life would be forever changed before another sunset arrived. Now she stood beneath the highest ceiling she had ever seen while the entire kingdom stared at the impossible ring wrapped around her finger. Then, from somewhere beyond the enormous courtroom doors, a loud crash echoed through the palace corridors. The startled murmur sweeping across the hall fell silent as every guard instinctively turned toward the entrance. Emily looked up just as the heavy oak doors slowly opened, revealing a quiet stable worker standing in the doorway with a lantern still hanging from one trembling hand. The moment his eyes met hers, the mysterious signet ring shimmered with brilliant silver light, and the young man stared at Emily as though he had been searching for her his entire life. 3 days earlier, Emily Harper had never imagined that her quiet life would lead her to the heart of Blackwood Castle. She arrived just after sunrise with a single leather satchel resting against her shoulder, its worn straps carrying years of travel between small villages where ordinary families knew her simply as the healer who never turned anyone away. The towering castle gates rose nearly 50 feet above her, their black iron frames engraved with the crest of the royal wolf. As she stepped into the vast outer courtyard, polished stone reflected the morning light while rows of royal guards watched every visitor with disciplined silence. Everywhere she looked, wealth and authority surrounded her. Elegant carriages lined the entrance. Nobles crossed the marble walkways wearing embroidered cloaks trimmed with silver thread. Royal physicians carried polished wooden cases filled with expensive instruments. Emily glanced down at her own faded forest green dress and weathered boots before quietly reminding herself why she had accepted the king's summons. She had not come to impress anyone. She had come because someone needed help. A young palace attendant guided her through winding hallways until they reached the grand reception chamber reserved for the kingdom's most respected healers. The moment Emily entered, conversations slowed. Several famous physicians looked at her with polite curiosity before realizing she was not another assistant. A middle-aged noblewoman wearing deep crimson robes allowed herself a quiet laugh. "Surely this child is lost," she said. Another healer smiled thinly. "Perhaps the kitchens requested fresh herbs." A few scattered chuckles followed. Emily lowered her eyes for only a moment before offering a respectful greeting. She had grown accustomed to being underestimated long before arriving at the palace. Her grandmother had once told her that true healing began with listening instead of speaking, and Emily had carried those words into every home she had ever visited. Lord Victor Ashford soon entered the chamber with measured confidence. His silver-trimmed robes announced his position before anyone spoke his name. "The Alpha King appreciates every effort made on his behalf," he announced. "However, only the most qualified among you will be permitted near His Majesty." His gaze eventually settled on Emily. "You were summoned because every healer in the surrounding provinces was invited. Do not mistake that invitation for equal standing." Emily simply nodded. She expected no kindness from strangers. Before anyone could escort the selected physicians toward the royal chambers, a frightened stableboy rushed through the open doors carrying urgent news. One of the royal stallions had become dangerously distressed and refused every handler. Several guards immediately followed him toward the stables while the noble healers remained where they stood, unwilling to dirty their robes for an animal. Emily quietly stepped away from the gathering and followed the frightened boy across the courtyard. Inside the royal stable, the massive white stallion stamped nervously, its breathing uneven as frightened grooms struggled to calm it. Yet Emily noticed something unusual. Standing near the far wall was another stable worker, a quiet young man dressed in simple brown work clothes. Unlike everyone else, he made no sudden movements. His silver eyes never left the frightened horse, and although he never spoke a single word, the animal slowly turned toward him instead of pulling away. Emily carefully approached with open hands, offering the horse a calming mixture of crushed lavender and fresh mint. As the stallion gradually relaxed, her fingertips accidentally brushed the quiet stable worker's wrist. An invisible warmth surged through her hand like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. The young man suddenly looked directly into her eyes, startled by something neither of them could explain, while the royal stallion lowered its head and quietly knelt before him. The stable fell completely silent after the magnificent white stallion lowered itself before the quiet worker. Every groom froze where they stood. Even the restless horses in the neighboring stalls stopped shifting their hooves, as though they too recognized something no human could explain. Emily slowly withdrew her hand from the young man's wrist, but the lingering warmth refused to fade. It had not felt like ordinary body heat. It had felt alive, ancient, familiar in a way that made no sense. The stable worker quickly stepped backward, lowering his eyes as if embarrassed by what had just happened. He shook his head gently, trying to reassure the others that nothing unusual had occurred, but he never spoke a single word. One of the older stable masters sighed with relief. "He cannot talk," the man quietly explained to Emily. "Never has, at least not since he arrived here 7 years ago. We simply call him Nate." Emily glanced back toward the young man. Nate carried himself with quiet humility, yet something about him felt strangely out of place. His posture was too straight for a stable worker. His movements were calm and deliberate, almost graceful. Even the way he reached for the horse's reins looked practiced rather than learned through ordinary labor. Before Emily could ask another question, the white stallion gently nudged Nate's shoulder with remarkable affection. The older stable master smiled faintly. "That horse belonged to Prince Nathaniel before the prince disappeared. No one has ever been able to calm him except Nate." Emily looked at the magnificent animal with growing curiosity. Royal horses were trained to recognize only those they trusted. For one that had belonged to the missing prince to show such devotion toward an ordinary stable worker seemed impossible. As the stable slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Emily noticed something else. Near the back wall stood a large polished mirror used to inspect saddles before ceremonial rides. Every worker walked past it without concern. Nate did not. He deliberately chose a longer path to avoid seeing his own reflection. Emily watched quietly until the stable master called everyone back to work. Moments later, the palace attendant returned to escort Emily toward the royal chambers. As she followed him through the winding corridors, she found herself thinking less about the Alpha King she had been summoned to heal and more about the silent young man whose touch had awakened something impossible. When she finally entered the king's private chamber, she found Alpha King William seated beside a tall window overlooking the eastern gardens. His silver hair reflected the afternoon sunlight, yet the strength described in countless stories seemed dimmed by deep exhaustion. Emily respectfully introduced herself before beginning a careful examination. She checked his pulse, listened to his breathing, and quietly observed every detail that experienced physicians often overlooked. Nothing resembled a natural illness. His heartbeat remained steady until a servant placed the royal crown upon a nearby table. Almost immediately, the king's breathing grew heavier. His fingers tightened against the armrest, and a shadow of discomfort crossed his face before disappearing again when the crown was removed. Emily said nothing, but her thoughts raced. The illness was not inside the king. It was responding to something around him. After completing the examination, she requested permission to return the following morning. King William agreed with a tired but kind smile. As Emily stepped into the hallway, she noticed Nate standing alone at the far end of the corridor delivering fresh oats for the royal horses. Their eyes met only for a heartbeat. Suddenly, without warning, a clear voice echoed inside Emily's mind. "Do not let them crown Victor." She stopped walking instantly. The corridor remained empty except for the silent stable worker, who looked just as startled as she felt. Nate slowly pressed one hand against his temple, confusion filling his silver eyes as though he had heard the same impossible words, yet neither of them understood who had spoken or why. Emily did not sleep well that night. Long after the palace corridors had fallen quiet, two questions continued circling through her mind. Why had the Alpha King's condition changed whenever the royal crown came near him, and how had a silent stable worker known words he should never have remembered? Before dawn, she returned to the royal gardens carrying a small basket of fresh herbs gathered from the castle greenhouse with permission from the gardeners. The cool morning air carried the scent of pine, damp stone, and blooming white roses that lined the pathways leading toward the royal stables. As she approached, she found Nate already awake, quietly brushing the same white stallion beneath the pale golden light of sunrise. The horse lifted its head the moment Emily appeared and walked toward her without hesitation. Nate smiled softly at the animal before looking at Emily with the same mixture of curiosity and uncertainty he had shown the day before. Emily greeted him warmly, although she knew he could not answer. She carefully removed a small notebook from her satchel and handed it to him together with a charcoal pencil. "If speaking is difficult," she said gently, "perhaps writing is easier." Nate hesitated before accepting the notebook. His fingers moved slowly across the page until one short sentence appeared in neat handwriting. "I do not remember much." Emily sat beside the wooden fence while the morning sunlight warmed the stable yard. "Do you remember your family?" she asked. Nate quietly shook his head. "Do you remember coming here?" Again he shook his head. After a long silence, he wrote another sentence. "Only dreams." Emily leaned slightly closer. "What do you dream about?" Nate stared at the page for several moments before writing three simple words. "Snow. A tower. Wolves." Emily felt a quiet chill despite the warmth of the morning. None of those memories belonged to an ordinary stable worker. Before she could ask another question, loud voices echoed from the opposite side of the courtyard. Several young noble visitors had entered the stables for riding practice. One impatient rider demanded the white stallion for himself despite repeated warnings that the horse accepted almost no one except Nate. The animal immediately became restless, stamping against the stone floor and refusing every command. Stable hands hurried forward but accomplished nothing. Nate instinctively stepped toward the frightened horse. Without raising his voice or making any threatening movement, he simply lifted one open hand. Every horse inside the stable became perfectly still. The white stallion lowered its head and calmly walked toward him. Even the restless animals in neighboring stalls relaxed as though responding to an invisible command. The noble visitors exchanged confused glances. One stable master whispered under his breath, "Only the royal bloodline has ever calmed them that quickly." Nate looked equally startled by what had happened. He lowered his hand immediately, almost afraid of his own instincts. Emily noticed something else at that exact moment. Several royal wolf guards passing outside the stable unconsciously bowed their heads as they walked past Nate before suddenly realizing what they had done. Embarrassed, they straightened at once and hurried away without speaking. None of them seemed able to explain why their bodies had reacted before their minds. Emily watched every detail in silence. The pieces no longer felt random. The horses trusted him. The wolves respected him without thinking. His dreams belonged inside the castle. His touch awakened impossible memories. Then her eyes drifted toward the inside of his left wrist as sunlight slipped beneath his rolled sleeve. Hidden just below the skin rested a faint crescent-shaped birthmark identical to the ancient royal crest carved above the entrance to Prince Nathaniel's abandoned chambers. Nate followed her gaze and quickly covered the mark, confusion filling his face once again. Before Emily could ask about it, a palace messenger arrived carrying an official summons. Lord Victor requested her immediate presence in the forbidden royal library because, according to his message, someone had finally found a portrait of the missing prince. Emily followed the palace messenger through a narrow corridor lined with towering shelves that disappeared into the shadows above. The forbidden royal library occupied the oldest wing of Blackwood Castle, a place where only members of the royal family, the chief archivist, and the king's closest advisors were normally permitted to enter. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming across stained-glass windows, illuminating thousands of leather-bound volumes that preserved centuries of royal history. Lord Victor Ashford stood waiting beside a large oak table where several ancient portraits had already been arranged. His expression remained polite, but Emily sensed the careful calculation hidden behind every word. "You have shown unusual curiosity regarding our missing prince," he said evenly. "Perhaps these paintings will satisfy your questions." Emily stepped closer to the first portrait. It depicted a young Prince Nathaniel Blackwood standing beside the same magnificent white stallion she had calmed only hours before. His silver eyes reflected quiet confidence, his dark hair rested against the collar of a formal black coat, and a heavy signet ring bearing the Blackwood crest gleamed upon his right hand. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. The resemblance to Nate was remarkable. The shape of the jaw, the calm expression, even the small crescent-shaped birthmark visible near the prince's left wrist beneath his sleeve matched exactly what she had seen in the stable. She looked back toward Lord Victor. "They look almost identical." Victor offered a patient smile. "Many people have said the same." He slowly opened a weathered archive containing official royal records. "But appearances often deceive. Prince Nathaniel disappeared 7 years ago. His body was never recovered, yet the investigation concluded there was no possibility of survival." Emily quietly studied the faded documents spread before her. Every page described the prince's disappearance in nearly identical language, yet something felt strangely rehearsed, almost copied from an earlier report. Before she could examine them more closely, Victor carefully unfolded another portrait from beneath the stack. This painting showed a second young man with the same dark hair and silver eyes. "This," Victor explained, "is Noah Blackwood." Emily looked up in surprise. "There was another son?" Victor nodded. "An illegitimate child. Hidden from public knowledge to avoid scandal. He resembled Nathaniel closely enough that even experienced servants occasionally mistook one for the other." Emily remained silent as Victor continued. Some have wondered whether the stable worker you met is actually Noah rather than Nathaniel. It would explain the resemblance without rewriting history. His explanation sounded reasonable, yet Emily noticed something unusual. The portrait of Noah appeared much newer than the painting of Nathaniel despite supposedly being created during the same period. Even the parchment beneath it lacked the faint aging visible on the older royal records. Before she could question the difference, Lord Victor carefully rolled both portraits closed. "I trust this settles the matter." Emily politely thanked him and prepared to leave, but as she reached the library door, an elderly woman quietly stepped from between the towering bookshelves. She wore simple archivist robes dusted with age and carried several fragile scrolls pressed carefully against her chest. Without speaking to Victor, she accidentally dropped a folded scrap of brittle parchment near Emily's feet. Emily bent to return it. As her fingertips touched the faded paper, a sudden image flashed through her mind. She saw the same library many years earlier. A frightened young prince hurried toward a hidden bookshelf while placing a silver signet ring inside a narrow stone compartment concealed behind an ancient wolf carving. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Startled, Emily looked back at the elderly archivist. The woman met her eyes for only a brief moment before giving the smallest almost invisible nod, as though she knew exactly what Emily had just seen. Emily left the forbidden library carrying far more questions than answers. The image she had seen when touching the brittle parchment refused to fade from her thoughts. It had felt nothing like imagination. She had seen the frightened young prince hide the royal signet ring behind a carved stone wolf as clearly as though she had been standing beside him. More unsettling still was the silent acknowledgement from the elderly archivist, who had looked at Emily as if she had witnessed the same memory before. Instead of returning to the guest quarters assigned to visiting healers, Emily quietly made her way back toward the oldest wing of the castle after sunset. The evening bells echoed softly through the stone corridors while servants finished lighting hundreds of lanterns for the approaching night. The palace had become quieter, but not empty. Guards still patrolled the main halls, and voices drifted from distant council rooms where preparations continued for the upcoming succession assembly should the Alpha King's condition worsen. Emily slipped into the library through a smaller side entrance the archivist had deliberately left unlocked. The old woman was already waiting beside the same towering bookshelf without appearing surprised to see her. She gently motioned for silence before pressing one weathered hand against the carved wolf's head. A section of the stone wall shifted almost silently, revealing a narrow passage hidden behind centuries of carefully arranged books. Emily followed her into the concealed chamber where dust covered everything except a single wooden pedestal standing in the center of the room. Resting upon it was an empty velvet box shaped to hold a ring. Emily immediately recognized it from the vision she had experienced. The signet ring was gone. Beside the empty box lay a folded parchment sealed with faded blue wax. The archivist nodded for Emily to open it. Inside, elegant handwriting covered the fragile page. The message had been written by Queen Eleanor, Nathaniel's mother, only days before the prince vanished. Emily carefully read each line. The ring must never remain hidden forever. It will reveal itself only to the one who remembers my son before remembering his title. She continued reading until another sentence made her heart stop. If Nathaniel forgets himself, do not remind him with words. Let kindness awaken what power cannot. Emily lowered the letter slowly. Every encounter she had shared with Nate suddenly carried new meaning. She had never treated him like a prince because she had never believed he was one. She had simply offered kindness to a lonely stable worker everyone overlooked. Before Emily could fully process the discovery, hurried footsteps echoed outside the hidden chamber. The elderly archivist quietly extinguished the nearest lantern. Through a narrow opening between the bookshelves, Emily watched Lord Victor enter the library accompanied by two trusted attendants. He carried another leather archive beneath his arm and walked directly toward a locked cabinet marked with the royal crest. After unlocking it, he removed several official records and replaced them with different documents taken from his own case. Emily realized with growing disbelief that he was quietly altering the kingdom's history while everyone believed the archives remained untouched. One attendant hesitated before asking, "What if someone recognizes the stable worker?" Victor calmly closed the cabinet and answered without emotion. "They will not. Tomorrow they will receive proof that he is Noah Blackwood, not Nathaniel. Once the council accepts that lie, no one will ever search for the missing prince again." Emily covered her mouth to keep from making a sound. She had finally uncovered the truth she had been searching for, but as Victor and his attendants disappeared into the corridor, she understood that by sunrise the entire kingdom would be presented with convincing evidence designed to erase Prince Nathaniel forever. The next morning, Blackwood Castle awakened beneath a grey sky that seemed to mirror the uneasiness spreading through every corridor. Servants whispered while carrying polished silver trays toward the grand hall. Royal guards stood at every entrance in greater numbers than before. By noon, the council would gather to announce new findings regarding the missing prince, and the atmosphere throughout the palace felt heavy with expectation. Emily carried Queen Eleanor's hidden letter safely inside her satchel as she hurried toward the royal stables. She found Nate exactly where she expected, gently feeding fresh apples to the white stallion that refused to leave his side. The horse greeted Emily with a quiet nudge before returning its attention to the silent stable worker. Nate immediately noticed the concern on her face. She handed him the small notebook he always carried. Without speaking, she wrote a single question. "Do you trust me?" Nate looked into her eyes for several long seconds before taking the charcoal pencil. "More than myself." Emily felt both relieved and saddened by his answer. She carefully unfolded Queen Eleanor's letter and allowed him to read only the final sentence. "Let kindness awaken what power cannot." Nate stared at the elegant handwriting. His fingers trembled slightly as though the words stirred something buried deep within him. He slowly pressed one hand against his temple. Fragments of unfamiliar memories flashed across his mind. A woman with warm blue eyes smiling beside a fireplace. A young boy laughing while chasing white wolf pups through a snow-covered courtyard. The weight of a silver ring resting against his palm. The memories vanished before he could grasp them completely. Nate closed his eyes, breathing slowly until the dizziness passed. Then, for the first time, he whispered a single word. "Mother." The sound was quiet and strained, almost forgotten after years of silence, but Emily heard it clearly. Tears immediately filled her eyes. He looked equally shocked, touching his own throat as though he could not believe his voice had returned, even for a single moment. Before either of them could speak again, loud trumpets echoed across the castle grounds. A palace herald announced that every member of the royal household was to gather inside the great court immediately. Emily and Nate exchanged uncertain glances before following the growing crowd. Inside the magnificent hall, Alpha King William sat upon the throne, visibly weaker than the day before. Lord Victor stood confidently beside him holding several newly sealed royal documents. Nobles filled every seat while scholars, physicians, and military commanders waited in complete silence. Victor raised one official scroll high enough for everyone to see. After careful examination of the royal archives, he declared, "The council has confirmed that the stable worker known as Nate is not Prince Nathaniel Blackwood." A wave of whispers spread through the hall. Victor continued without hesitation. "His true identity is Noah Blackwood, the illegitimate son of the late king. While he carries royal blood, he possesses no legal claim to the throne." Several council members nodded after reviewing the documents placed before them. Emily immediately recognized the seals Victor had replaced inside the library the previous night. Every piece of evidence supporting his claim had been carefully manufactured. Nate lowered his eyes, confusion and pain crossing his face as though he desperately wanted to believe the records despite the fragments of memory struggling to return. Emily stepped forward before fear could silence her. "Those records are false." Her voice echoed through the stunned courtroom. Every head turned toward the young Omega healer. Victor smiled calmly, almost expecting the interruption. And what proof does a village healer possess against the royal archives? Emily reached into her satchel and slowly removed Queen Eleanor's letter. Before she could unfold it, a brilliant silver light suddenly burst from somewhere deep within the ancient palace walls. The entire court fell silent as a hidden compartment beneath the empty throne reserved for the missing prince quietly unlocked with a sound that had not been heard in 7 long years. The soft silver light continued spilling from beneath the forgotten throne until every corner of the great hall shimmered with quiet brilliance. No one spoke. Even the palace musicians standing along the walls lowered their instruments as the ancient mechanism hidden beneath the stone floor slowly completed its movement. A narrow compartment emerged from the base of the throne that had remained untouched since the day Prince Nathaniel disappeared. Resting inside upon faded blue velvet lay a single silver signet ring engraved with the Blackwood wolf crest. The entire royal court stared in stunned silence. Lord Victor's calm expression disappeared for the first time. "Do not touch it," he ordered sharply. "The mechanism is old. It proves nothing." Emily looked toward Alpha King William. Although weakened, the king slowly nodded. "Bring it here." She carefully approached the hidden compartment. The moment her fingertips brushed the ancient ring, another wave of warmth flowed gently through her hand. Images flashed before her eyes with astonishing clarity. She saw a frightened young prince placing the ring into the compartment while Queen Eleanor embraced him one final time. She heard the queen whisper softly, "If darkness steals your memories, let kindness bring you home." Then the vision changed. Emily saw Lord Victor standing inside the northern tower years earlier, holding a small crystal vial while a confused young Nathaniel struggled to remain awake. She heard Victor quietly promise that the kingdom would soon forget the true heir forever. The vision ended as quickly as it had begun. Emily drew a slow breath before lifting the ring from the velvet cushion. The silver crest immediately glowed beneath the afternoon light. Every noble present instinctively stepped backward. According to the oldest royal traditions, the Blackwood signet could never be carried by someone the royal bloodline rejected. Emily turned toward Nate, who remained standing near the entrance with uncertainty filling his silver eyes. He looked overwhelmed by the countless strangers now watching him. She walked toward him without hesitation. "I think this belongs to you," she said softly. Nate slowly reached out his hand. The instant his fingertips touched the ring, he staggered slightly as another flood of memories rushed through his mind. Snow drifted across castle walls. A little boy laughed beside a younger brother. Queen Eleanor smiled while fastening the same ring onto his finger. Alpha King William lifted him into the air after his first riding lesson. Then came another memory. Lord Victor offering him a cup filled with clear liquid inside the northern tower before everything dissolved into darkness. Nate closed his eyes tightly. His breathing became uneven, but there was no fear in his expression, only recognition. When he opened his eyes again, tears quietly gathered beneath them. He looked directly toward the throne where King William sat waiting. This time, words came without hesitation. "Father." The single word echoed through the chamber with astonishing clarity. Alpha King William rose to his feet despite every physician urging him to remain seated. His tired eyes filled with emotion as he looked upon the young man he had believed lost for 7 years. Before anyone else could react, Lord Victor stepped forward. "This proves nothing," he insisted. "Memories can be manipulated." Emily calmly held up Queen Eleanor's letter for everyone to see. The elderly royal archivist quietly walked into the center of the hall and bowed before the king. "Your Majesty," she said, "the Queen entrusted me with preserving the truth until the rightful heir remembered who he was." She placed several untouched original records upon the council table. Their royal seals matched those on Queen Eleanor's letter perfectly. Council members hurried to compare them with Victor's newly altered documents. One by one, their expressions changed from confidence to disbelief. The handwriting, dates, and official seals revealed the same undeniable conclusion. The authentic archives had never named Noah as the missing heir. Every false record had been created years later. As silence settled across the great hall once again, the silver signet ring gently slid from Nate's open palm onto Emily's finger without either of them moving, and no matter how carefully she tried to remove it, the ancient ring refused to leave her hand. For several long moments, no one inside the royal court dared to speak. The ancient signet ring rested securely upon Emily's finger as though it had chosen its place long before anyone inside the hall had been born. She gently tried once more to remove it, twisting it carefully without force, yet the silver band remained perfectly still. Confused, she looked toward Nathaniel and quietly held out her hand. "It belongs to you," she whispered. Nathaniel smiled with a warmth that had been missing from his face for 7 years. "Then let us discover why it refuses to leave you." Alpha King William slowly descended from his throne, every step watched by nobles, guards, and servants alike. Although age and illness still lingered upon his face, his posture had regained the quiet strength of a father who had finally found the son he believed lost forever. He embraced Nathaniel without hesitation. The great hall remained completely silent except for the soft rustle of ceremonial banners moving beneath the afternoon breeze drifting through the open windows. Many of the older council members quietly lowered their heads, unable to hide the emotion filling their eyes. Nearby, the elderly royal archivist unfolded one final parchment preserved by Queen Eleanor. Its ink had faded with time, yet every word remained perfectly clear. She read aloud so the entire court could hear. "If the day comes when my son forgets his own name, the signet shall not return to him first. It shall remain with the one whose kindness restores the prince before the kingdom remembers the heir." Emily felt the ring grow gently warm against her hand once more. The meaning became unmistakable. The ring had never been meant to recognize power. It recognized the person who had restored hope to the rightful heir when every title had already been forgotten. Nathaniel stepped toward Emily and looked at the silver crest resting upon her finger. "You saw me when I was only a stable worker," he said softly. "You believed me before I remembered myself. You treated me with compassion before anyone spoke my name." Emily lowered her eyes, suddenly overwhelmed by the attention of the entire court. "I only did what any healer should do." Nathaniel smiled gently. "No. You did what very few people ever choose to do." He turned toward the gathered nobles. "Many searched for a prince. She simply chose to help a lonely man." His words settled across the chamber more powerfully than any royal proclamation. One by one, the royal guards knelt before Nathaniel, recognizing their rightful crown prince. Moments later, members of the council followed, acknowledging both the restored royal records and Queen Eleanor's final testimony. Lord Victor stood silently as the authentic archives replaced the altered documents upon the council table. Alpha King William calmly announced that every official record would be restored exactly as Queen Eleanor had preserved them, ensuring that no future generation would inherit another rewritten history. As sunlight poured through the towering stained-glass windows, the heaviness that had lingered over Blackwood Castle for 7 years seemed to disappear. Weeks later, the kingdom celebrated not only the return of its crown prince but also the reopening of royal healing houses throughout every province under Emily's guidance, offering care to every family regardless of rank or wealth. Nathaniel spent those weeks traveling among the people instead of claiming the throne immediately, determined to earn their trust through service before wearing the royal crown. On a peaceful autumn morning, he met Emily in the castle gardens beside the reflecting pool where golden leaves drifted gently across the water. She looked down once more at the signet ring still resting comfortably upon her finger. "I suppose it has made its decision," she said with a quiet laugh. Nathaniel nodded. "So have I." He offered his hand, not as a command from a prince, but as an invitation from the man she had first met inside the royal stable. Emily accepted without hesitation. Together they walked beneath the bright morning sky while children laughed among blooming gardens and the bells of Blackwood Castle rang with joy instead of sorrow. Years later, when Nathaniel became Alpha King, people often remembered the day the missing prince returned. Yet the story they cherished most was not about a throne reclaimed or a kingdom restored. It was about an unknown Omega healer who entered the royal court carrying nothing but a satchel of herbs and a compassionate heart, then walked out wearing the signet ring that had waited 7 years to find the only person worthy of carrying both the prince's trust and the kingdom's hope.